Wyoming Territory, 1883. The wind was howling like it had something to prove when Cade Fletcher found her on the edge of his land, half frozen and crumpled beneath a cottonwood, her skirts soaked through, and her breath shallow. He pulled his horse to a stop, boots hitting the snow-crusted ground with a thud. She looked up, face pale, lips cracked, one hand on her swollen belly. "Help me," she whispered. Cade did not ask questions. He wrapped her in his coat, lifted her up like she weighed nothing, and rode hard back to the cabin. It was not until she was lying by the fire, her hands trembling as she reached for the heat, that she managed more than a few words. "My name's Maribeth Ryland," she said between coughs, eyes flicking to the kettle he set on the stove. I'm about 8 months along." Cade knelt beside her, handing her a tin cup of warm water. "You walk all the way out here alone?" Her eyes watered, but she nodded. "The man who got me this way, he's a merchant from Salt Lake. Rich, respected. He said he'd marry me. Then once I started showing, he said I'd lied, that it wasn't his." Cade's jaw tensed. "He throw you out?" She looked away. "Said if I ever came near his house again, he'd have me arrested." Cade sat back, staring at the fire. He had not planned on company, least of all a pregnant woman with nowhere to go. He had built this cabin for quiet. After the war, after the years of drifting ranch to ranch, he had wanted space to breathe. But now she was here, and she was alone. "You can stay," he said finally, "until the baby comes, and longer if you need." Her eyes searched his face carefully. "Why?" he shrugged. "Because you need help." "That's enough reason." In the days that followed, Cade did not ask about the merchant again. He focused on keeping her warm, fed, and safe. He chopped more wood, added extra quilts to the bed, and built a cradle out of pine. Maribeth watched him with quiet eyes, often resting with her hands on her belly, as if shielding it from the world. She never asked for more than he offered, never cried, though he caught her once staring out the window, tears streaming without a sound. "You ever been around a birthing before?" she asked one morning as he brought in water from the well. He shook his head. "No, but I'll be here." She smiled a little. "You do not have to stay. I know it is not your problem." Cade looked at her, eyes steady. "You are under my roof." "That makes it my problem." Her eyes softened. "That might be the kindest thing anyone said to me in months." He did not know what to say to that, so he just nodded and went back to chopping wood. Maribeth began to fill the space like sunlight. She cleaned where she could, made meals when she had the strength. She sang soft lullabies at night, her voice low and sweet as she traced her belly. Cade found himself listening from the other room, the sound wrapping around the cabin like a blanket. Then late one night, the pain started. She woke him with a scream that sliced the silence in two. He was by her side in seconds, helping her sit up, holding her hand when the contractions came hard and fast. "It's early," she gasped, gripping his arm. "Too early. You are strong," Cade said, holding her steady. "You can do this." She screamed again, sweat pouring down her face, and he wiped it away with shaking hands. He had never felt so helpless. But hours later, just as dawn cracked across the snow, the baby came. A little girl, red-faced and wailing, full of life. Maribeth sobbed with relief, cradling the child against her. "Her name is Grace," she whispered. "Grace Ryland." Cade stood back, breathing hard, chest tight. He had not expected this. He had not expected her. Or the way his heart felt like it cracked wide open at the sight of Grace's tiny fingers curling around Maribeth's. Or the way Maribeth looked at him, eyes wet, tired, but shining. "Thank you," she said. He swallowed hard. "You do not have to thank me." She reached out, her fingers brushing his hand. "Yes, I do." He sat beside them, not saying much, just watching. And for the first time in years, Cade Fletcher felt something shift in his chest, something warm, something dangerous. He had taken her in because it was the right thing to do. He had not expected to feel this. He had not expected to care. But as the fire crackled and Maribeth hummed softly to her daughter, Cade realized something he had not known until that moment. He never wanted them to leave. The snow had begun to melt in patches beneath the cottonwoods, leaving behind a quilt of mud and pale grass. The air still held a bite, but the light lingered longer now, stretching across the plains like it was trying to coax the land back to life. Inside the cabin, Grace slept cradled against Maribeth's chest, her tiny body wrapped in one of Cade's old shirts, stitched smaller with rough thread. The child's breathing was soft and sure. Maribeth hadn't slept much, but her eyes were clear when she looked up from the rocking chair. "You don't talk about your people," she said, voice quiet but steady. Cade leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching a pair of magpies flit through the trees. "Not much to say." "That's not true. There's always something." He didn't answer right away. "Then, my father was a blacksmith in Missouri. Mother kept to herself. They died when I was 17. Fever took her and he drank himself into the ground not long after." Maribeth adjusted Grace slightly, careful not to wake her. "You were drafted." "No, enlisted on my own. Thought maybe I'd come back with something worth holding on to." He looked at her then. "Didn't." She didn't press, didn't offer sympathy, just nodded as though marking the weight of it. That afternoon, she took careful steps outside with Grace bundled against her. Cade was repairing a split rail along the paddock and looked up as she approached. "She needs sun," Maribeth said, "and I wanted to stretch my legs." He set the hammer down. "You're sure you're ready?" "I wouldn't be out if I weren't." She stood watching him work, her breath visible in the cold. "You've kept this place up all by yourself," he nodded. "You ever think about leaving?" "Sometimes. But I always come back. Guess I don't know where else I'd belong." She looked toward the mountains, their distant white peaks sharp against the sky. "I thought I belonged somewhere once. Back in Utah, I'd walk past the same houses every day. Folks nodded, said good morning, asked about my family. Then the moment I became inconvenient, they looked straight through me, like I was already gone." He didn't look away from her this time. "You're not invisible here." She held his gaze for a moment, then glanced down at Grace. "She's going to know how to ride. I'll see to that. I don't want her growing up afraid of the world." Cade picked up the hammer again, adjusted the rail. "Then she won't." That night, after the fire had burned low and Grace was asleep in her cradle, Maribeth stepped outside again. Cade was on the porch, sharpening a skinning knife, the lantern beside him casting a low glow. "I never thanked you for the cradle," she said. "It's beautiful." He didn't look up. "Did what I could." She sat on the top step. "You built a thing with your hands just for her. That counts for more than you think." He set the blade aside, wiping it clean. "I watched my brother's wife die in childbirth, back in Missouri, lost too much blood. They buried her and the boy the same day." She looked over slowly. "I'm sorry. I thought it'd be like that again. When you were screaming, He stopped, jaw tight. "Didn't know if you'd make it. But I did." He nodded, eyes on the trees. Maribeth pulled her shawl tighter. "You don't have to carry that fear now." He turned to her, the lantern light catching the worn lines around his eyes. "You're stronger than anyone I've ever known." She reached over, resting her hand against his. "You didn't have to help me, but you did. And I'm not leaving unless you ask me to." He didn't speak, but his fingers turned beneath hers, holding on. Inside the cabin, Grace stirred and Maribeth rose to go to her. She paused at the door. "You mind if I plant something come spring? Just a patch of herbs, maybe carrots." "Grace will be eating solids before long." Cade stood slowly. "It's your land too if you want it." She smiled, not out of politeness, but something deeper. "Then I'll plant what'll feed us both." By late March, the wind had lost its bite. The thaw came slow, but steady. curling its fingers through the cottonwoods and stirring the earth awake. Mud clung to Cade's boots as he walked the perimeter of the cabin, checking the fence-line with Grace bundled against his chest in a sling Maribeth had stitched from an old flour sack. She'd shown him how to tie it twice before he got it right. "She quiets quicker with you," Maribeth had said that morning, brushing straw from her skirt. "Maybe she knows you're the one who found us." Cade hadn't answered then, but he'd looked at Grace a long time before tucking her under his coat. By midday, Maribeth was kneeling in the patch of ground beside the cabin, fingers pushing through the damp soil, marking rows with a stick. Her sleeves were rolled to the elbow, and her hair had come loose in the back. She wore her weariness like a shawl most days, but not today. There was something steadier in her now, something settled. Cade approached quietly, Grace sleeping against him. "You're planting early. It's riskier to wait. If frost comes again, I'll cover the shoots with burlap." She looked up, brushing dirt from her palms. "I found a few seeds in a tin behind the stove. Parsnips. You grow them before?" "No. But I'll dig the trench if you show me how deep." She handed him the stick without a word, and for a while they worked side by side, the only sound the crows in the trees and the soft sigh of wind through thawing brush. Later, as they sat on the porch steps, Grace nestled between them. Maribeth folded a length of cloth in her lap, her needle moving in small practice stitches. "Did you ever want children?" she asked, eyes on the fabric. "Didn't think on it much. But if things had turned out different," he was quiet for a moment then, "might have. If there'd been someone to build that life with." She nodded, lips pressed together, then threaded the needle again. "I used to dream about a little boy, always a boy for some reason. He'd run ahead on the path behind our house, and I'd pretend to be angry when he tracked mud through the kitchen." She paused, her expression unreadable. "Then I had Grace, and I don't think I'll ever want for more." Cade looked down at the child between them, her hand curled into a fist beneath her chin. "She looks at you like you hung the moon," he said. "She's the reason I kept walking that night," Maribeth said, her voice lower now. "When my feet were bleeding and every part of me wanted to lie down and let the cold take me, I thought of her. I thought of what it would mean to leave her to someone else's mercy." Cade's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. "She'll never know that kind of fear," Maribeth added. "Not while I'm breathing." "She won't have to," he said. She turned toward him, letting the needle rest in her lap. "You say that like it's a promise." "It is." She studied him, her gaze searching. "That merchant, he still doesn't know where I went. I didn't tell anyone. But sometimes I wonder if he's looked, if he's the type who wants to make sure no one sees the mess he left behind." "If he ever shows up here," Cade said, "he'll regret it." Maribeth didn't flinch. "I don't want revenge. I just want peace." "I know." He shifted slightly, brushing a pine needle from Grace's blanket. "When I was a boy, I thought peace was something that came when you were done fighting. And now I think it's something you make where you can. With your own hands." Maribeth reached for his fingers, her touch light but sure. "I've never had a man speak to me like that, like I belonged where I stood." "You do." She held his gaze, and something changed between them, then not sudden, not loud, but certain as rain in spring. Inside, Grace stirred, her small voice rising in a soft cry. "I'll get her," Cade said, already rising. Maribeth caught his wrist. "Let me. You've done enough for one day." He nodded, letting her pass, the scent of rosemary and loam trailing behind her. As the door closed behind her, Cade stood still on the porch, hand curled around the place where hers had rested. The sun hung low over the hills, casting everything in gold. He didn't know how long they'd stay, didn't know what each day would bring. But he knew this. He didn't want a life without them in it. The lambing started in the first week of April. Cade had traded 2 barrels of salted venison that winter for a pair of ewes from a homesteader to the north. not thinking much would come of it. But one gave birth to twins just after sunrise, and the other followed 2 days later. He built a pen beside the barn using spare slats, patching the gaps with pine boughs. Maribeth came out with Grace bundled in her shawl, cradled on her hip. She stood just outside the fence, watching the lambs wobble after their mother, legs too long for their bodies. "She'll like watching them grow," she said. "They'll need names then," Cade replied, wiping his hands on a rag. Maribeth tilted her head. "You name the first pair." "I'll take the next set." He leaned on the fence post. "All right, then they're ash and birch." She smiled faintly. "Trees, strong ones." They fell into a rhythm as the days lengthened. Maribeth began mending the battered linen curtains that hung crooked in the windows, working by the light that stretched later into evening. Cade split cedar for the stove and carved a new latch for the back door, which had started to sag. Grace began to lift her head more, her gaze following movement with a growing sense of wonder. She would quiet when Cade held her, especially when he whistled low, tuneless songs as he worked. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and the sky turned the color of cooled iron, Maribeth laid Grace in the cradle and stepped outside, rubbing the back of her neck. Cade was oiling the hinges on the barn door. He glanced up as she approached. "I want to earn my keep," she said, arms folded. "More than just planting." "You already are," he said. "I could take in sewing," she continued. "There's a stage that stops in Lander twice a week. I could mend shirts, patch petticoats." "Folks always need something stitched." Cade rested the oil can on the fence rail. "You don't have to prove anything." "I know." Her voice was even, "but I want to." He studied her a moment, then nodded once. "All right, I'll ride into Lander next week, ask around. Maybe someone wants a seamstress who won't ask questions." She blinked. "You do that. I do more than that." She turned her face toward the wind, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "When I was 16, I thought I'd marry a man with a shop. Someone with clean fingernails and a good coat. I thought that meant safety. And now I think safety looks like someone who listens when you speak." Cade didn't offer anything in return, but he didn't look away. That night, as rain tapped against the roof, they sat across from each other at the table. Grace was asleep again, her tiny form swaddled and still. Maribeth had drawn a pattern on a scrap of muslin, sketching ideas for lace trim she could add to handkerchiefs. "You always sew this well?" he asked, watching her fingers move. "My mother taught me before her eyesight went. Said it was a woman's best chance to make her own way if she had to." Cade leaned back, folding his arms. "You think she'd approve of you being here?" "I think she'd be glad I kept my daughter fed and warm," she said. "The rest what people think, what they say it doesn't hold up once you've stood in snow with no coat and no place to go." He nodded slowly. "You ever plan on going back east?" "No," she set her needle aside. "There's nothing there for me now, but I'd like something I can call mine. A place where no one's doing me a favor." Cade's voice was quiet. "This place can be yours." She met his eyes across the table. "Don't say that unless you mean it." "I don't say things I don't mean." The oil lamp flickered between them, casting long shadows on the walls. Maribeth reached for the muslin again, but her hands paused. "And if I stayed past spring?" "Past planting and sowing." Cade stood, walked around the table, and set his hand on the back of her chair. She looked up slowly. "Then I'd build you a proper room, not because you need it, but because I want to." She didn't smile, didn't speak, just reached up and rested her hand over his. Neither moved for a long while. From the cradle, Grace stirred once and then settled, the sound of rain soft against the roof. By the time the river ice broke and the cottonwoods leafed out, the sewing orders had started to come in. Cade hung a small wooden placard beside the gate stitched with care. It read in plain script, "Mending and embroidery fair prices." He carved it himself, and Maribeth painted the letters using a brush made from trimmed horsehair. People came quiet at first, mostly women riding up from nearby homesteads or riding side saddle in wagons, their clothes worn thin from winter. They brought trousers split at the knee, shirts missing buttons, aprons frayed on both ends. Maribeth never asked more than she needed and always took the time to hem straight and stitch secure. Word passed slowly, but it passed. One afternoon, as Cade repaired the ridgepole of the barn roof, he spotted a man on horseback approaching from the north road, lean frame, gray coat, and a hat pulled low. Cade climbed down, hammer still in hand, but the man stopped a good distance from the house and raised a hand in greeting. "Name's Orrin Palmer," he said once Cade came close. "I run freight through Fort Washakie. Heard you've got a woman here can sew worth a dime." "She's busy most days," Cade said flatly. Palmer nodded. "Don't mean to intrude, just wondering if she'd mend a satchel strap." "My wife's sewing gave out and she's tied it with hemp for weeks." "I'll ask." Cade returned to the house, where Maribeth was rinsing a length of cloth in a basin by the fire. "There's a man outside," he said. "Needs a strap mended. Says he hauls freight out of Washakie." She wrung the cloth and set it aside. "That's Shoshone country. Probably carries trade goods east. You all right with him being here?" She dried her hands on her apron. "If he's decent and leaves when he's got what he came for, I've no quarrel." Palmer didn't linger. He tipped his hat when she returned the satchel, thanked her, and rode off before the sun dipped behind the ridge. That night, Cade sat at the table sharpening his drawknife while Maribeth nursed Grace in the rocker. "He didn't look twice at me," she said. "Didn't ask where I was from or why I'm here." "Good," Cade said simply. She looked over at him. "Do you think they'll keep coming? If they've got work for you and you want it, yes." She rested her cheek against Grace's head. "I do want it, but not just for the coin." He lifted his eyes. "Then for what?" "For the knowing," she said, "that I can keep something going. That I've got use. You've always had that. Maybe, but it feels different when it's not borrowed from someone else's goodwill." Spring deepened, and with it came a quiet expansion of life. The lambs grew into lanky, sure-footed creatures, and the garden Maribeth planted began to push green through the soil, radish tops, carrot fronds, and a few hardy herbs she'd nursed from dried seed. One morning, Cade came in from the barn with sawdust in his beard and a square-cut beam balanced on his shoulder. "I've been thinking," he said, setting it down near the hearth, "about the room." Maribeth looked up from the cradle, where she was sewing a new bonnet for Grace. "What room?" "The one I said I'd build." She didn't speak right away. Then she rose slowly, crossed to him, and placed her hand on his chest. "I don't want a room at the edge of your house," she said. "I want to be part of what you build." "I was hoping you'd say that." They married in June. No preacher, no paper, just spoken words under the same cottonwood where he'd found her, with Grace tucked in a sling against Maribeth's shoulder. Cade carved 2 plain rings from old coin silver, and she wore hers beside the scar that marked where her hand had cracked in the cold that first night. They built the room together. Cade laid the frame, and Maribeth filled the cracks with wool and clay to keep the wind out. Grace learned to crawl across the kitchen floor, hands slapping softly against the pine boards. In late summer, they took a wagon into Lander to trade for sugar and salt, and while Cade loaded sacks, Maribeth stood at the mercantile window, watching Grace reach for a blue glass bead someone had left on the sill. "I want to raise her here," she said as they rode home. "Where no one decides what her worth is." "You already are," Cade said, and she knew then it was true. Years passed. The garden grew wider each season, and the fence stretched farther as they took in more animals. Cade built a smokehouse behind the barn, and Maribeth taught Grace to thread a needle by the time she was 5. They never spoke of the man in Salt Lake again. Not because they feared him, but because he had no place in the life they'd made. They sat most evenings on the porch, hand in hand, watching the light fade behind the hills. Cade would hum the same low tune while Grace played with scraps of cloth or chased the hens around the yard. Sometimes Maribeth would rest her head against his shoulder and whisper, "We made it." And Cade would say, "Yes, we did." Because they had, together,